it is upwardly impossible to truly know the effect of a given moment on the larger spectrum of our lives while we're in the middle of that moment. I can think of some moments that have changed me in a singular instant. The first time I heard the heartbeat of my child. The first time someone called me rabbi. The first time I was arrested. These things changed me in the moment, but in truth, I had no sense of how much my life would continue to be changed by those experiences. We all have emotional turning points, physical or even global crossroads that compel a new way of being to emerge. We usually talk about them as before-after moments. Before the accident and after the accident. Before I moved and after I moved. Before the divorce and after the divorce. Before I came out and after I came out. Before COVID and after COVID. If we're fortunate enough to live long enough, we have more than one before-after event in our lives. Danny Shapiro, author of the book Inheritance, makes the powerful point that an experience is not considered a before-after moment unless we allow the experience to change us. Otherwise, it's just a moment in a series of other moments in our lives. She should know. In her book, Danny describes being raised by a loving Jewish family in New York. Just like many of us, she was interested in learning more about her ancestry, so she took a DNA test. And what she found shocked her. Her father was not her biological parent. In her childhood, the stories that surrounded her about her family surviving the Holocaust, the relationships she had with her family, all that came into question. Danny could have dismissed the biological evidence and never investigated the situation further. But Danny believes that we are a combination of biology, memory, history, and the soul. And when something shakes a part of what grounds us in our identity, it doesn't just change the after, it changes the before as well. There was no before for her to go back to because a large, loving part of who she thought she was now has another story. It's natural to want to return to the before times, to try our best to not let trauma or change permeate us. That's why it's so human to feel assuaged doing things the way we've always done them, aspiring to return to the way things were before. But what we see in our lives changes us. And if we aren't changed by it, then we are destined to live an arrested life, unable to evolve for want of returning to a state of being that no longer exists. Our Jewish tradition grapples openly with this concern. When the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 CE, our entire way of practicing Judaism was destroyed along with it. How could we continue to connect with God if we have no place to offer animal sacrifices? How could we continue to self-govern if there were no more priests? How could we believe in a homeland while living in exile? In hindsight, sitting happily in our synagogues or our homes with a prayer book on our laps or on our screens, we would love to turn to these struggling Jews and say, don't worry, we will invent liturgy and prayer and brisket, and there will be things like bat mitzvahs and baby namings and non-binary affirmation ceremonies. We will continue for centuries beyond this devastating trauma. But we can't do that. We can't comfort anyone with the future when they're in the middle of change. When reading Psalms from that time period, the language is all about feeling forsaken by God and believing they are witnessing the end of Judaism and Jewish peoplehood. It's clear that the author is wondering if they could be an after while enduring such hardship. And they cry out, like in Psalm 74, Otetanu lo ra'inu, ein od navi velo otanu yadei adma. No signs appear to us, there's no longer any prophet, no one among us knows for how long. It's impossible to dream of an after when you're in the middle of letting go of the hope of returning to the before times. Werner Erhard, leader in transformational change, known for his activism in Ireland, teaches about what happens to us when we get stuck in one part of our story. He says that all stories need completion, by which he means that when we get trapped in one part of our story, like just the before part or just the middle of the change part, we end up living half stories, or what he calls incomplete stories. These incomplete stories become our limited narratives of our future. We remain stuck in the old story and unable to emerge into an after with a new state of being. And the person who is stuck in her incomplete story says, I am this and I am only this way and I can never be this way. He says, I am a failure, I am an addict, I'm messed up, I am broken, and those things are the only ways I can ever be defined. It's not just individuals who do this. Our country does it. Around racial injustice, economic isolation, misogyny. We allow for protest or shocking pain to awaken us, and as quickly as we can, we return to the before times, ignoring everything we just learned. But the before times, they're not waiting for us. There's no before to go back to. In our country, there will never be a time in our lifetimes where the fear of a pandemic isn't in our bones. Masks, infectious disease, protection, fear for the vulnerable. These are some of the lasting realities that will come with us into the after zone of the pandemic. Just like we won't ever sit in the back of Frisch Hall on Long Meadow ever again. Just like we'll never walk our loved ones all the way to the airplane the way we could before 9/11. Or the way we will understand use of force by police after the death of George Floyd. Or the way our children in our synagogue are surprised that men can be rabbis too. These moments must be seized as opportunity for self-definition, not as a demarcation of trauma and loss, but as points of evolutionary change. This morning we read from Genesis 22. We read this portion every year of Abraham being called by God to take his son Isaac and offer him as a sacrifice to God as proof of Abraham's faith. And Abraham answers, Hineni, here I am. Now, there's evidence that the Canaanites practiced child sacrifice. Specifically, the firstborn were part of ritual killing to appease the Canaanite gods. And Abraham, being a Canaanite, might have been compelled to follow the practice of his birth culture by offering his son to Adonai. In this historical context, the painful story of Abraham and Isaac makes slightly more sense, except our God, Adonai, isn't a run-of-the-mill Canaanite God, and Adonai has no appetite for child sacrifice. In fact, the only name for the temporary hell we have in Jewish tradition is called Sheol, which is the name of the place where child sacrifice happened in Israel. Hell is the place where you go when your suffering is so extreme, you convince yourself that sacrificing children is the only way to survive. As Abraham stands above his son holding a knife, he hears an angel of God cry out to him, Abraham, Abraham, and Abraham says, Hineni, here I am. And the angel continues, El tashlich yadcha el hana'ar ve'al ta'as lo mu'uma. Do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him. In the before times, Abraham was put to a test. His faith was based on what he was willing to lose. And then there's a turning, and Adonai demands something different from Abraham and his descendants. Abraham's faith test becomes based on what he's willing to build. Each before-after moment asks us to say, Hineni, here I am. And as much as I want to stay in the world where I know the rules, where I know who I am, where I can rest the knowledge of doing things the way I've always done them, I'm aware that the before has changed, that there's no returning, and therefore the only way forward is to move forward. The God we believe in, the tradition we practice, models for us an unbreakable spirit and capacity for change. After the first temple was destroyed, it took 70 years to return from exile, and we went right back to building a bigger, stronger temple. And after that was destroyed, we went into exile again. But it was not with the aspiration of building a third temple. Can you imagine? If all we've created and nurtured and imagined in this time with equity and music and story, our rituals, our Talmud, the whole breadth of the last 2,000 years, would we give it all up to go back to the way we were at the beginning? Now, I'm not saying that our suffering has meaning, that we wouldn't have become what we became if it wasn't for our pain. That just doesn't work for me. Rather, when opportunities for change do occur, and we choose the radical, faith-oriented hope to continue forward, to forge a new path, to finding an after, that's when we evolve as human individuals and as a collective. Holidays are only invested with meaning, with how we act after we leave the safety of our prayer space. How we walk out the themes of rebirth, atonement, and forgiveness the rest of the year, allowing the central themes of this holiday season to permeate us. In our Rosh Hashanah liturgy, we say, the gates are opening. that over the next 10 days, we must find a way to transition out of the last year, not so that we can go back to a perfectly clean slate. That's a misread on atonement. Atoning doesn't clear us of our transgressions. We must work to change our behaviors and seek forgiveness for those we have hurt for that to be true. Rather, this season, this moment, today, is when we stand up and say, Avinu Malkeinu. I acknowledge that I stand at a crossroads in my own life, in the Jewish institutional life, as well as my country story, and I choose to release myself from the fantasy of returning to the before times and get to work in building the after.